Hi, it's great to be back. It's nice and calm over here at GA. You've got not quite as many kids. But it's good. And I'm in the business of inspiring Australia now, which is lucky because the topic of my thesis was around how scientists inspire the public. And so here we have a captive audience of skilled scientists and science communicators. So hopefully some of this will be really interesting to you. Just a shout out. Thank you to all who contributed. It was a bit of a work by numbers because I did crowdsource some of the transcription with 100 interviews about an hour and a half long each. It was quite a large volume of material just to get through to document the words. I don't think I could have got over the line without the help from GA and the team in Viz and Products and Promotion in particular. Thank you very much. And to the exec who really gave me some good feedback, such as, you're going to survive, keep going. So that was a big deal. And of course my partner Ben, my long-suffering partner Ben, 9 years of hell, if you ask him. He doesn't want to talk about it anymore. Just a tiny bit of background. So I am descended from the great physicist T.H. Levy and grew up with his two daughters, whom I just knew as rather sweet elderly ladies, but actually turned out to be razor-sharp scientists in their own right. So I guess in my own family there's a long lineage of science and biomedical science in particular related people. And I worked on the UK's Science Year campaign many years before coming to GA. And some of the kind of problems that have inspired the Australian government to kick off the National Innovation and Science Agenda are the same problems that we're seeing around the world. And these are some of the factors, declining enrolments, particularly in the Western world, fewer people really dreaming of becoming a scientist or working in STEM-related fields, skill shortages, and we're seeing a lot of language out of industry at the moment in Australia saying, we need to act, we need people in the pipeline for the jobs of the future. A lack of role models, which is, I'm going to talk a bit more about that because it's really relevant to how we perform as researchers and scientists every day. And fears, really genuine fears about the innovation cycle. Is Australia really producing enough people? And other countries, the same situation. Are we producing enough people to really supply the kind of knowledge base that's needed? A little bit of research informed the work. So we're finding these kind of stats coming out of global studies, particularly in the developed world. We're seeing very many fewer kids wanting to become scientists and engineers. Even in the really high-tech countries such as Japan and Korea, we're seeing that trend as well. And as part of programs like National Science Year or National Science Week, even in Australia, we look at using science heroes or role models as kind of a public way of galvanising support from young people and attracting them in. But when we look at some of the studies, scientists really are bottom of the list in terms of being at the front of mind for who people say they're inspired by. Now, when you dig in a bit deeper, it's actually a lot more complex than that and much more interesting. But some of these stats are quite interesting because this is coming out of a museum that deals with the public all the time. So in their sample, which wasn't massive but was still several thousand, they're finding pretty low rates of acknowledgement for scientists. And when you look at other studies, they find similar things, and the people who get on the list are dead. So you get a lot of Einstein, you don't get a lot of Chris Pygram. I looked at those who are living because I thought this might help to tell us a bit about what we might do. Are science heroes really a useful thing? What don't we know? This is a quote from Lindsay Tanner. You might remember him. He was Australia's former finance minister, and he was very keen on that program Why Is It So? Do you remember that? You can still see clips of this on the ABC YouTube site, which is fantastic. I just love this. There must be many Australians who were first inspired to pursue a commitment to science by the flamboyant professor. Now, I don't know about you guys, but he looks a little bit crazy to me. And perhaps the ideas of what's inspirational and galvanising for, presumably the young mind have changed over time, because while the flamboyant professor was very dynamic as an entertainer, I'm not sure whether he would cut the mustard as an ideal role model for, say, a 13-year-old girl who's considering her choices. These days you might have known that Neil deGrasse Tyson came out to Australia last year as part of National Science Week, and every year there's a tour of a couple of people. So he was someone I picked up in the study as well, and the question is really, are science heroes a solution to some of these overarching problems that we're seeing globally? So these were the kind of areas of interest that I was looking at. Who are they? What can their experiences tell us? And what are the implications of what we're finding? So I thought I'd start, just a quick whip through the literature. I'm going to outline some of the interviews, some of the findings, and then some recommendations, which of course you will all go away and heartily apply, no doubt. It'll save you time rather than having to read the whole 110,000 words. So, this is the best way. So what do we know about scientists? Well, they are complicated. Some snippets from the literature. I think you'll all share this view of scientists. They tend to be stable, self-sufficient, dominant introverts. We know rather little of the social and cultural context within such a personality develops. So this is interesting. We don't know much about the kind of social factors, but they are social. So here's a sociologist, a historian of science rather, who finds that scientists are some of the friendliest and most hospitable people you're going to meet, but they do need their heroes and their villains. So there are lots of swirling social networks and competing claims and friendly rivalries going on within science, and some unfriendly ones as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. They are political. So if you look back through the history of science and in science communication, right back through until the 18th century, you look at these ideals of science as being a kind of esteemed body of knowledge, a privileged world, and communication such as through things like the Royal Society's Christmas lectures, the great expositions of the 18th and 19th centuries were really about the wonders of science and the fact that scientists held this comprehensive knowledge base close to their chest, and they could sort of dole it out as and when they saw fit. And over time, the kind of understanding of communication within practices of science has changed a lot. We now know that just simply giving out information and expecting people to engage with that, what we call the deficit model, as in the audience knows nothing and I'm going to impart that to you, we know that that doesn't really get you very far. It's good for some things, such as there's a tsunami, run, but it's not very good for should we extract coal seam gas and are we comfortable with what that means. So the College of Science, this great ideal of the collective scientific enterprise, has been revealed over time to be a lot more complex in its social embeddedness. And scientists are conflicted. They're constantly coming in to clashes with one another. And this sociologist of science, Merton, he identified that we have these conflicting norms, what they call normative behaviours in science. And so on the one hand, you've got to be first. Your research has to be at the top to really succeed. But on the other hand, you're expected to be humble. So it's hard to be really, backing yourself and also to recognise the work of others. So there's basically, these kind of researchers are saying there are contradictions in how science operates, and it's easy for scientists to come into conflict. I'm sorry the text isn't showing here, but things like being collegial or being individualistic. So there's several pairs of these conflicting norms that come through for people. And what I got interested in is whether we have these conflicts in communication as well, because I'd started to think perhaps they were from some of the things that I was seeing. Oh, so here we go. So just to give you some ideas, you're meant to have an open mind, but you're also meant to follow on from the body of work that's been done before you. And of course, science can be a little bit mean as well. If you want to get your information out there, you've got to jump over a lot of hurdles, and there are plenty of people waiting to either slow down your own research in order to get theirs out first, or to contradict your findings. And we see this all the time in the public domain. So to get a paper accepted and published is a huge feat, as I'm sure anyone who's actually doing science in the room will attest. And they do have some communication problems. As I mentioned, we do get things like this resistance to new technologies, new work, and some conflict over what the science is saying and how to interpret it. So we'd say, coal seam gas is a really good example of this. So you remember that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan got burnt the first time around by various stakeholders. So science is not a straightforward communication path. Everyone wants and has a piece of the action. So we're doing big science now. It's a global world. It's multinational. It's cross-disciplinary. It brings huge new communication challenges, but also big opportunities. And hopefully this research will help to create pathways for people to take up some of those opportunities. So I had a look at who our science heroes are, and I would say to a room of people, who's your hero and why? And I was able to generate from those kind of processes lots of names, also a lot of desktop searching, having a look. Now the definition of hero is very broad, intentionally so, because it really is a very subjective thing. It depends on your own experiences. And I'm sure each of you would be able to think of people who are very influential, inspiring, a good role model, or very heroic to you. When I started doing interviews, I also asked people I was interviewing for their their heroes and for recommendations, and that yielded a few extra names. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about those people now, but there was a real range of people who came out of that. Some were broadcasters, so people like David Attenborough, the Mythbusters, Adam Spencer, Dr. Karl, Harry Butler, all these great names that we've seen on TV screens over time. We had the really high echelon scientists, so the Nobel laureates, Peter Doherty, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, the Helicobacter stomach ulcer bug guys. Harry Kroto, who discovered buckyballs or Buckminster fullerene, a whole range of people like that. And then we had the ordinary people, the unsung heroes, if you like. So they might have just been very influential within their domain, science teacher, and other people who were like a local mentor, someone who gave an individual an opportunity. But I wanted to start with this guy. This is Ian Taylor. He's a former science minister in the UK, sits in the House of Commons. And he had a lot to say about the challenges for policymakers trying to communicate science or being responsible for talking about science in the public domain. And they're reliant on information coming back from public science agencies such as GA. So here he is. And he does a lot of public communication work as well. And he talks about the fact that in the political world you have to talk, you have to represent science very animatedly in many different forms, and you've got to understand the relevance, and you've got to understand the priorities, and you've got to contextualise that against the great social interest that's out there. He was responsible for funding the Large Hadron Collider from the UK government's point of view, and also for funding the research that led to Dolly the sheep. And he says essentially there's this huge breadth that he has to be not an expert in, but he has to be able to speak confidently to that and really understand what the issues are. And he talked about the fact that when the Dolly the sheep story broke, it was leaked by the media, and that Downing Street went into an absolute panic because they didn't understand the science, they didn't understand the implications, and they waited 48 hours before government said anything about this enormous breakthrough in terms of genetics. And he basically phoned up the Prime Minister's office and said, we need to go out. I'm going out with a statement because we can't sit here and say nothing. And it was because of that discomfort within policy making, or at least decision making, around what the science meant. And so I think that's a lesson for all of us, which is while we understand the detail, we need to be able to roll it up and communicate with policymakers in a way that is relevant to them, because they will then go and make decisions about what to say, what to do, what policy to implement. And at the moment, Science Meets Parliament is running, and I was up there yesterday, and it was interesting to see 200 scientists get together annually, and they learn about how to interact with policymakers. And if you haven't been involved, that's a useful thing to have a look at. So there's Dolly. And another policymaker who is the former chief scientist for Scotland, Anne Glover, talked about the fact that we've got a lot of parliamentarians who don't have a science background, and so we need to make science more relevant. So, and they really need to look for solutions in the modern world. So just to give you some background, that really this is where science is really coming into, I guess, the legwork of communication, in that you can see it really clearly for public science agencies. It's having to do this kind of legwork all the time, and our exec is very nimble at getting these kind of higher order messages out there. So when I looked at the communication conflicts, these are the kind of things I found. I found that we've got this communicating about the group's work versus putting yourself in the limelight, communicating in dramatic ways versus being more passive. So in dramatic, you might take a bit of license, you might exaggerate, you might generalise, you might use the word bugs instead of bacteria, and also general versus specific. Generalisations, metaphors, analogies are really easy to understand if you're not a scientist, but they're wrong if you are a scientist. They're not accurate enough. So we've got these conflicting ways of communicating about science, and these conflicts are happening, it seems, all the time. A few limitations for the study. Essentially, I looked at Western cultures of science. Wasn't a homogenous data set. It covered people of ages 18 to 78 pretty much, or 88 even. But there were some really useful findings despite the fact it was not homogenous. I went out and about, travelled around the world for about 10 months, dragging my suitcase behind me, and I discovered there's some categories of these scientists who communicate. The showman, the person who's out there in front. Anyone got suggestions of people who fall into this category? I'll give you one. Tim Flannery would be a good example, where he's out in front, climate change commissioner, previously talking all the time, keeping the science at the forefront, but criticised for doing so. the explorer, the Jacques Cousteaus of this world, even the David Attenboroughs of this world who are positioned against that, this is the wild world and I have knowledge and I've gone into places that the mere mortal can't go. The pioneer, the Nobel laureates fall clearly into this. They're the first and they achieve these incredible things. The genius, the Teslas, the Edisons, the Einsteins, often the quiet achievers who may not do much communication, but what they've found is very important to communicate. And the outsider, those who sort of pop up seemingly from a minority and then make a big impact. Ada Lovelace here, but also say a Neil deGrasse Tyson who not only represents science in terms of astrophysics and astronomy, but he represents race in the discussions around science and those other societal elements that come in. The lifesaver, the people who are bringing medical welfare to the world. The teacher, I think this teacher looks quite mad, but he is very enthusiastic and there's a lot of evidence around the impact of good teachers. And that responsiveness, and I guess here's where we talk about that dramatic style of presentation. I want to use Suzuki and Flannery as a little bit of a case study today because they're really interesting in terms of how they appear in public, the relationship with the public and the science and how it's contested. So you can see some of the relationship elements of that. People may love him in the public domain, the fact that an individual is talking about the science in a way that's accessible and passionate, very compelling. And if you look through the Twitter sphere, you'll find people talking about scientists all the time. Oh, Bobby Cerini did a great talk. No, it was rubbish. No, it was terrible. I loved it. So good to see a woman on stage, etc., etc. So the discussions go on through social networks, and they're more visible now than we've ever had them. So for a researcher, you can trawl through this and have a look at what's going on, how people are reacting. Scientists can really get into those echelons of pop culture. And so Wallace Broker, who discovered the world's thermohaline circulation system, the ocean conveyor belt system, he did a sketch on the back of the napkin, and in this moment he worked out this is how all these ocean currents were connected. And that diagram has been morphed and used on the back of drink bottles and on the back of branding for companies. So it's sort of been subsumed into discussions of pureness and naturalness and water and the earth. So this scientific diagram has really had a life of its own. There are also very, potentially harmful, but in that social and pop cultural world, scientists are discussed and debated and and contested in terms of their value to society. So I had a look at pathways into science because I thought, how do we get these heroes? What's actually inspired them? How do they get there? And I'm going to flick over some quotes, so I'll just speed through and then stop every now and then and highlight a few particular things. There are a number of different factors, and again, I think some of these will be familiar. Family, very important. So Brian Gainsler, astrophysicist, grew up in a science family. My dad encouraged me to build circuits and motors and all the rest of it. My mum was mathematical. I got that bent from her. And many people in the study talked about their families as having a science background. Teachers. Adam Hart Davis, who's a broadcaster in the UK, talked about the amazing maths teacher who was brilliant and who, when he was going off to high school, said, I have one word for you, science. So that kind of directive, I think you're good at science, that's where you're going to go. The natural world was really interesting. So people like David Suzuki, but also Mike Archer, the paleontologist, Tim Flannery, the paleontologist, lots of people outdoors engaging with nature and finding real intrinsic interest and curiosity out there. This idea of escaping into the wild. Now, David Suzuki was interned during the war with his family as a prisoner was an enemy alien basically in Canada. So grew up in a very isolated way. So for him in particular, this is a very compelling anecdote. But others talked about growing up in the country, spending time in the wilderness on their own, a lot of self-guided play and discovery. Anne Glover again talks about this explosive power of the chemistry set that her brother gets, where she's seeing this explosion and she says, I don't know what that is, but I know it's for me. So she's really engaged by that experience, that interactive experience. And this is where things like GA's Education Centre become so important, because we may be offering the thing that triggers that, wow, oh my gosh, there's a fossil here, what is this? You can have these moments in the person's mind where their mind opens up to the possibilities, and from that point they may go on, if they're lucky, to another experience and another. So these kind of informal learning, interactive experiences are really powerful. Now museums get a mention as well, planetariums. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about growing up in New York. He can't see the sky. He doesn't actually see the night sky until he's 9, and he sees it in the planetarium. And he doesn't believe it's real because there can't possibly be that many stars. And what I love about this quote is, to this day, when I see the greatest skies that ever are, from the mountaintops with telescopes, I look up and say it reminds me of the planetarium. So the idea that the museum creates an experience that he couldn't get somewhere else. Now this is one from Tim Flannery. So Tim Flannery does an arts degree, and he takes himself off to the Museum of Victoria because he's been fascinated by fossils and he's been snorkelling in the bay in Melbourne. He gets taken under the wing of Tom Rich, who many of you will know is also a paleontologist, and that is how he ends up getting into science, because Tom Rich says, clean up the fossils, it's a new species, you should do a master's, the rest is history. But this sort of combination of the personal interest and the experiences coming together to create a totally different life path for this individual. Although he did say he always felt like he was going to do something to do with science. And some of the people in the study said the same thing. Now, does anyone know who this guy is? Patrick Moore. Yeah. So he is an incredible guy because he was the lead presenter on the BBC's Sky at Night program. And he was very quirky, always wore a monocle. His partner, his girlfriend, was killed in the war, and he never remarried. And he went on to be a hugely inspirational figure. He used to write back to every single person who wrote to him. And the broadcaster Quentin Cooper, also of the BBC, once asked a room full of science teachers, about 120 science teachers, did anyone write to Patrick Moore and get a letter back? 70 or 80 people put their hands up. So you can see it, the prolific output of an individual connecting and engaging with people. And again, I'll mention that again in a little while. TV, people on TV and popular media, books, very, very important for many people. Barry Marshall, the Nobel laureate, talked about how he'd read biographical novels as a kid, and he'd been really inspired by these tales. What's interesting about him is he talks about how he read books about the brother surgeons or the Mayo brothers and thought, I could do that. I could operate on my puppy or on people, as it turns out to be. So this idea that he could actually do the things that he was reading about or experiencing, very powerful again, that sense of self-identity being formed and people saying, I see myself as an individual who can do this. And I think this is where the inspiration comes in again, which is that when we model scientific behaviour, we don't have to be entertaining. We can just show people what real science is, because that's where the real interest is. Science is fascinating. And the processes of demonstrating why it's fascinating, how it's fascinating, are actually very inspirational to people. So Chris Lintott is the other presenter on the Sky at Night, and he was heavily influenced by Patrick Moore. He was one of the kids who wrote to Sir Patrick. He was one of the kids who went down to Sir Patrick's home observatory and got taught stargazing. He was one of the kids who joined an amateur astronomy club and started communicating amateur results, who ends up doing astrophysics and being a leading astronomer, as well as maintaining to be a presenter on Sky at Night. So, interesting interwoven experiences again with other scientists, inspiring role models playing a key role. And these inspirational ideas that there's stuff out there to be played with. Letter writing. David Attenborough was fascinating to talk with because he's obviously someone who would receive a lot of correspondence, and indeed he does. And I guess what he was saying here, I received a letter from a child aged 7 and the next day from a professor aged 57, and they were basically saying the same thing to me. And what was really fascinating was when I asked people how audiences had responded to them when they communicated, lots of questions, lots of correspondence, thousands from time to time, people being really bombarded with correspondence, and then those who made the effort to write back sometimes ended up in quite long-running inspirational sequences with individuals who would then turn up 10, 15 years later and say, I did science because of you. So the suggestion was that if you make the effort to really create a relationship, it has real meaning to people. And I think we can all relate to that, which is if you feel someone cares about you as an individual, you're nurtured, you're more likely to be open-minded about what they might have to tell you that's next. So again, when it comes to inspiration, we want people to have open minds about their futures, and one way we can do that is by building relationships and interpersonal communication. So I'm just going to skip over this, but I'm highlighting Nancy Rothwell, again, 1,000 letters after giving a Christmas lecture. And it's an example of the young boy who turns up and says, I went into medicine because of you. So just in summary, we had lots of really interesting experiences along pathways into science. And some of those were about the individuals. They were about the heroes and the role models who came in and were inspirational. And so I wanted to have a look at how people inspired and the kind of techniques they use. And there were some really interesting things in here. I'm just going to skip over these because they're related to pathways again. This one's a good one from David Suzuki, where his mother weeps because she can't understand why he'd give up medicine to become a fruit fly specialist. So family expectations pretty high there, I think, and lots of people did have that, but equally lots of people didn't feel that they were high achievers at all. Some of the Nobel laureates talked about not feeling that they were particularly gifted or special in any way when they were going through their education. It was just something that happened later. And this is really important to us, I think, as an organisation where mentoring and role modelling within the workplace, and it's true for doctoral students, postdoctoral students, it's true for people who are at the beginning of their professional careers and still sort of working out what they're doing, and you could probably say this is true of our graduate students in government when they come through, is that the mentoring role that you can play as an individual to those who are earlier in their career than you is profoundly important. And it's important at every career stage. So in actual fact, people never stopped having heroes, but they changed over the course of a career. So people would admire someone's work differently when they were 21 to how they would admire it when they were 45. But we always have these opportunities to engage with the people around us. Mike Archer talks about his mother's support and the fact that she lets him bring a snake or a bird into the house and boil it up to get the skeleton. So again, very in the background to a lot of these stories is this vision of parents, mentors, teachers being gently facilitating this individual's curiosity. So they think they're doing it all themselves, but actually the parents are in the background. And this is where you as parents are also critically important, that when you enable and facilitate, but allow the individual, your child, to explore in their own way, you provide a powerful supporting backdrop to that. And when we look at who goes into science and who doesn't, all of the program work that I've done in recent years strongly suggests that parents are this critical element. So it's not just the teachers, it is the parents and the family environment. And there is a lot of things we can do nationally to help encourage that sort of environment where it's safe and it's comfortable. Emily Cummins, the inventor, talks about her grandfather learning motor skills, invention skills in her grandfather's shed. And now she goes on to run workshops for young people herself with that skills transfer. So I'm just going to skip over these. There's so many fascinating quotes and extracts from people here. Some people concerned about what being a scientist meant. You might not get to do something important. You might be dislocated from the real world. And so it's a relief when people discover that science is practical, it's real, it's meaningful, it has a purpose, and it does something. But also you might get to discover something and be first, which is in the competitive streak that we all have, really important. So skip over some of these. Essentially, we're looking at self-guided pathways into science and practice of those skills, opportunities to rehearse it. Lots of good reasons to communicate science. It'll be a sales pitch for you. But you can create real change. You can influence people in big ways and in small ways. You get a kick out of presenting. A lot of people talked about the buzz, being in the audience, seeing the dynamic, watching the attentive faces, reading the body language and responding to that. And of course there are really material benefits as well, because in today's scientific world, very communication focused. You need to be able to write a good grant application. You need to be able to write a good report. You need to be able to write a good GA record if anyone's going to read it, a good executive summary. You need to be able to pitch a compelling case for gaining new funding. You need to be able to win an argument in a room full of your peers. And all of those are around communication skills. So the kind of rhetorical skills, the skills of debate and argument, are more important now probably than they've ever been, although I think they always probably have been important. They're visibly important at the moment. And there's a great story about one of the guys who missed out on the Nobel Prize, Doug Prasher. And a few years ago, you might remember, the Nobel Prize was awarded to some molecular biologists for discovering the fluorescence gene, which is now used as a tracker for all kinds of medical applications. And at the Nobel Prize dinner, there was a fourth person invited to sit at the table, and the media picked up on this and said, who is this guy? And it turned out that he was the postdoc who'd actually done the original work, and he hadn't been able to get funding to continue his work. And for whatever reason, perhaps he hadn't networked efficiently enough, perhaps he hadn't had quite the right set of communication skills, perhaps he was at the wrong institution, but he ended up leaving science because he couldn't get a job. And as he left, he handed over his research to the people who then went on to win the Nobel Prize. And he went on to become a car salesman in Central America. So, but there is a turn to the tale, which is as a result of appearing at the Nobel dinner and having the renewed media interest, people were outraged that he hadn't stayed in science. And he then got job offers, and now he's back working with one of the original guys again. So it's a happy story, but I imagine there's many unhappy stories of people who, for whatever reason, and I think communication skills are definitely a factor in this, are not as successful as otherwise could have been. So if you want to be successful, brush up on the common skills because they will really help you. People who you might know as the flagship people out the front: Helen Caldicott, anti-nuclear campaigner. And again, like Flannery and like Suzuki and others, possibly contested. Some people view her as going too far, and other people in the study talked about other individuals that I was interviewing and made comments and commentary about their communication skills, which is where this idea of the conflicting ideas of communication come in. Just skip over this. So we're talking here, Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the demand for information. There is pressure on people who are out there talking to talk more. And so it does feed itself. Once you start talking, you're going to get on the hot list for the media. They will call you once they know you've got something to say and you're articulate. So if you're doing a bit of media, be ready for that, because it's an easy path for journalists to talk to the same person. And you might wonder why one person is always in the limelight. It's partly because it's really easy for the media to keep them in the limelight. It's also because they're making themselves available and they're speaking in less than 7-second sound bites that are easily edited into a news broadcast. So again, when you get the offer for communication training coming out from Products and Promotion, strongly recommend that you get that skill of talking in short, sharp sentences, because that is a surefire way to get a GA head into the storytelling. If you can't talk succinctly, you won't get into the story. But of course the downside, this is from Ian Fraser, the inventor of the Gardasil vaccine, is that suddenly you're the instant expert and they expect you to talk about everything about which you know nothing. So this can be a real risk in that suddenly you're being asked about, what do you think of Madonna doing a pop concert? And you're like, but I'm a specialist in the cervical cancer vaccine. So, and a lot of people commented about this line they have to walk between being the expert within their boundary of knowledge and stepping beyond that. Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal in the UK, talked about that enjoyment of the communication, talking to the public. Again, I'll skip over this quickly. He doesn't enjoy his work as much if he can't talk to people about it. David Attenborough talks about the fun of making programs about science. Many of us, including me, want to go and tell somebody that they've seen something remarkable. And what making TV programs enables you to do is precisely that. It's great fun. And skip to the end, the more you can do that, the greater pleasure you get from it. So some people really they love it. Hands up, anyone who loves giving presentations. Yes, likely suspects. For those who don't like giving, presentations, why not? Feel like you're on the spot, a bit too visible, feeling a bit uncertain about whether you know what you're talking about. Flush bright red and stammer. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why people aren't comfortable giving presentations, but again, it comes down to practice. Practice makes perfect, and I think the Products and Promotion team can help you. If you'd like to improve communication skills, whether you're a scientist or not, they can help work through some of those issues, I'm sure. So I looked at those techniques. We had some really obvious signs of storytelling amongst the most gifted communicators, really looking at that dramatic style rather than the passive style, looking at simple language that relates to ordinary things that people can understand in their daily lives rather than the highly technical, highly specific things. So, and I guess in science it's about being able to scale between the two. You've got to be able to talk technically and in detail and thoroughly and accurately with your peers, but you also must be able to do your 10-second elevator pitch to the minister in the lift that summarises everything in a very short period. So, you've got to be able to have that diversity of skills in order to succeed in today's communication environment. And it does come with both benefits and risks. This guy was really interesting, Mark Plotkin, an ethnobotanist who talks about conservation of the Amazon and the indigenous people and the indigenous knowledge that relates to the botanical life, so the biomedicine of the Amazon and the rate at which it's being lost. He talks about storytelling as being something that you continually learn, and you learn it from watching other people do it, you learn it from doing it yourself. You need to be able to respond to different audience needs. Some people are happy sitting around a campfire talking, other people need music, they need visuals, they need more information, they need less information. And he's really talking about nuanced communication that he changes for each audience. He wants really to transform people, he wants to bring them on a powerful emotional journey so they get what the significance of the work is, which is we're losing the Amazon at an alarming rate. Here's why we need to pay attention to this. He gives hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lectures a year. And he's, again, still passionate. Wouldn't the world be boring if we didn't have this knowledge? We're going to lose it. And his off-sider, Ian Starr, who's an assistant who came to work with him, gave me another view on Mark Plotkin and said he's just got something. He's just got this gift for communication and people listen to him. But not just that. He is a great expert and he knows what he's talking about. So I guess you could say that he's, creme de la creme. He's risen to the top. Great communicator, really focused on the audience, but also really knows his business. And because he knows it, is able to roll it up and talk very succinctly about it. Harry Butler, alas recently deceased, we may remember him from Put It Back, was one of his great slogans, his mantra that he always talked about on telly. And he, again, lifetime of communication work in conservation. He had that mantra of keep caring, it's the only world we've got. And he wanted people to do this themselves, to know that they could experience the natural world in their own backyard, that anyone could do it. So I guess here's a question for all of us, which is when we're communicating, what is our motivation? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Because if we're just trying to give over information, it's probably not going to be sufficient. We need to be able to connect in with that emotional hook in order to get people to do something that we want them to do. What's the call to action as a result of your communication? So here we're coming to one of these conflicting problems, divulgation. Jacques Cousteau was accused of this as being a showman. A storyteller and a conservationist, he had trouble keeping his constituents happy. Scientists accused him of showmanship. Critics accused him of faking scenes. Networks demanded he keep his films full of intrigue, not earth-saving rhetoric. So what's a man to do? Here he is, trying his best to communicate, and he's being pushed and pulled in many different directions. And I think you can say the same of Tim Flannery. He's a great folk hero in a way. He's very visible. He's much loved in the Australian population. But I've heard scientists deliver unbelievably vicious criticism of him. And I'm just going to run through some of these kind of criticisms because I think they're really important to remember why communication is so important in science, because you're going to be fighting battles in one way or another, whether in the public mind or in the media mind or in the scientific mind. Just because a guy's well known doesn't mean he knows what he's talking about. He's an opportunist. He knows climate change is a buzzword, but a few months' work doesn't make him an expert. He doesn't let facts get in the way of a good story. He does a lot of broad brush stuff with broad consequences, and some of it is just plain wrong. I wish I could be as sure of everything, as anything, as Tim is of everything. So these are scientists quoted in the media, publicly going on record, and that's also unusual. People feel really strongly if they're willing to go on record. More shaman than showman, a folk mystic and prophet for the New Age remnant. And some journalists having their 2 cents worth as well. But when you talk to Tim Flannery and ask him about it, he experiences the wide range of views. He gets the feedback from the public, from the audiences, from the policymakers, and he gets feedback that tells him that how he's doing it is working really well. And I have heard tales of people going to work with him at Macquarie University because it's him, because they're inspired by him, because they are galvanised to make a difference because of him and what he models. So, it's a mixed bag. You're not going to win all the time, you're not going to please everybody, and I guess you've got to have a thick skin in the communications game. Now, I just draw your attention to Dr. Karl. You might recall he fronted the intergenerational report recently for the Australian government. And then sometime after that report was released, he reversed his support for that report, and it created waves of difficulty for government, which had kind of banked on having a public scientific spokesperson out in front to give a public face to this important report. And of course the ripples from that decision of his no doubt will play out over time. So what I always say is keep an eye on Dr. Karl in terms of public profile and what that does in terms of reputation and things like that. Let's skip over these. These are some characteristics that make people successful. Drive and persistence, self-comparison and modelling, basing yourself on other people, reputation and codependence, so working together. And this idea of lineages in science, which is if I've worked under Chris Pargram at Geoscience Australia and Stuart Minchin at Geoscience Australia, then I've got a reputation, a good reputation, because it's a reputable organisation and they're reputable individuals. And so within the worlds of science you get these lineages going on where an individual creates and attracts a posse of other individuals and they select them. You know, they will build up a repertoire of individuals around them who they think are really good. And so again, that communication skill, being able to impress people, being able to negotiate with people, being able to form part of that stable is very important. Leadership culture is profoundly important. And that's, I think, where communication again gets set from the top. If you have an organisation that's inward-facing and chokes back its communication style, your individual people within that organisation are not necessarily going to go on to be as successful as they could be. So I think there's a lesson in there institutionally which is about what kind of corporate body, what kind of staff do we want to have and what do we want them to say about our organisation. I'm coming to the end now of these findings, but the behaviours and their consequences were really interesting. So these conflicting norms again, self-interestedness, which is as a reviewer of a scientific paper, you're expected to be independent, but actually if you're about to publish in that area, as this person's account shows, you might choose to just delay the review process for someone else's work until you can get yours out. And that can have really profound consequences for an individual whose work is being delayed in that process. It's competitive and social. This is somebody who talks about how he set up a research lab, a culture of research that was frowned on by other scientists because it was exclusive. It created a new culture. It broke with the traditions of the institution and it created all kinds of social problems for the people who were in that network. But again, the key characteristics of people who are our heroes, and I use that term very broadly, are these kind of things: great levels of achievement, great expertise, great communication skills, persistence, they don't give up in the face of a fight, opportunism, they take advantage of opportunities when they come, and real leadership, and having had exposure to real leadership as well. And of course some really good reasons to communicate, because fame has got a lot of benefits as well as the downside. If you've got the wherewithal to answer 1,000 letters a week, you'll be fine. Most people don't, and this creates a problem for scientists in the public eye as well. Just managing their time. What's most important? Is it most important to do research, or most important to engage in these relational, social sides? And there's no simple answer. These are the consequences. You do cop it if you stand up and speak. But it is getting better. That seemed to also come out, that the norms for older scientists are much more rigid and less communication focused than the norms for younger scientists. And so we're sort of seeing maybe a generational change, or at least just that shifting globalisation of science also having impacts on what's required in the workplace. A few little problems: taking too much time out of research talking out of turn, being too big for your boots, but, you know, I think you can do it. And one person who does it pretty well is David Attenborough. I am slightly biased because he was one of my great heroes, so I had to triplicate the reference for the study to get him in there. But, you know, it is difficult. So I'm just going to skip to the very end and talk about Carl Sagan, another example of somebody who of his time talked out of turn, did a lot of great work in terms of public broadcasting, was roundly critiqued by some of his peers to the extent that he was excluded from membership of the great academies in the US. And that was a very unusual thing to happen, and it was directly related to his communication activities. And of course, then we have still got, in some cases, an attitude, and this is our former chief scientist saying, disapproving of people being the instant expert. Substituting decibels for substance is how he puts it. But I don't agree with him because I don't believe it is that simple, and I don't believe it's that black and white. Because actually the public requires more than what we have to do within science in terms of communication. And as Anne Henderson-Sellers points out, Anne Henderson-Sellers sits on the IPCC. She leads one of the working groups heavily involved in the whole climate change communication space. And she points out this difference, that the public is accustomed and needs to hear people who believe what they're saying and who are certain. Policymakers can't work with a range. They can't work with this kind of, oh, it might be this, it might be that. Certainty is what helps people to understand meaning. But of course, within science, we're constantly kind of saying, oh, well, there's an error rate and it's not black and white, it might be this, it might be that. So we have a lot of sensitivity to variations, small variations, we're not certain, but that lack of certainty can be a real problem when it comes to trying to get the message out there. And so Anne Henderson-Sellers talks a bit about that vagueness and the fact that if you bumble a little bit and you're not quite clear enough, you're not passionate enough, it can really mess up that public engagement. And that ultimately she's saying she thinks it's detrimental to the science because it undermines the reputation of science to not be able to communicate well. And taking it to an extreme, people who are out there talking, and Henderson-Sellers amongst them, cop a lot of vitriol just by fact that they're talking about the science. And those from GA who've been out perhaps talking about groundwater in the community might have copped some of this as well. There's very passionate feelings. People are very engaged in information about our world. They care about our world and what it meant, the impacts of knowledge on them and what change relating to that information might mean. And here's an example about David Suzuki. He engages in bad science, media manipulation, has cultivated a trusted reputation that he abuses by handpicking, etc., etc. So you're not, as I said before, you're not going to win all the time, but it's part of that fabric of discussion. And when we look at the model for communication now in science, as I said, the deficit model, that one way of, I'm here to give you information, which incidentally is what I've done today, I'm sorry about that. The model is about conversations, because that is where society is heading in terms of its communication needs. It wants to know, it expects scientists to be able to step up and explain the publicly funded research and explain the meaning and value of the work. And I think we still have a bit of a gap between the kind of training we get in science and the kind of training we really need to do a good job. Again, someone wants to punch David Suzuki in the nose because he cares more about the earth than he cares about people. And it gets much worse than this. I had to take those slides out because they weren't fit for broadcast. So, a few conclusions and a few recommendations. Science heroes are real. They really do make a difference. And those impacts can be very visible and they can also be very subtle. They're not all positive, they're not all controllable, but they are all real. And each individual who is in a network of other individuals has got an important role potentially they could be playing in inspiring the next generation. Or in fact inspiring the current generation, because we're all working all the time with our graduate students here at GA and others coming through, and students in the Education Centre. So just remember that. Open Day, profoundly important as a way to model some of these types of communication behaviours. And if you're not confident communicating, Open Day is a great place to start to have and try some of those communication skills. So here's my recommendations. Be inspiring. Try communicating a little more. Make it part of your daily mission. Look at the relationships you have and what impact you might be able to have there. Be generous with your time. And Gus Nossel talked about the importance of mentoring and mentors taking a little bit of time out to just take the time to sit down with people and help them understand and give them some skills. Keep it real. Science is amazing. It is curiosity driven. It can be exciting. It's also really strange, and strange makes it interesting. So when you're finding strange and interesting things, they're your hooks for storytelling. You can tell a 7-second story about why you think something is interesting, unusual, curious, cool, whatever it is. And think about how it relates to people's daily lives. Communicate more. If you get asked to say something or do something or make a presentation, if you're not too busy, even if you are too busy, consider saying yes. Ways that you can really get into conversations about science. By talking to your MP, Science Meets Parliament is a good opportunity, but just down the street in your electoral office. And listen, this came out time and time again. Audiences saying, we really wish scientists would listen. And we love it when people do respond and appear to hear us. So again, the two-way and the discussion-based communication. Short stories, visual, memorable, and when we look at the work of products and promotion and those kind of visual aid memoirs, really powerful for getting people to engage with the content, easily shareable, easily made into social media. Be able to move between audiences, get the training, listen again, and feel the buzz. Next time you're presenting, have a good look at the audience, watch their eyes, wave your hands around a bit to wake them up. Navigating the conflict, I'm afraid you're going to have to be all these things at once, and you're going to have to move between them. But it can be done, as we see from people like Tim Flannery, that you can be recognising other people's work and also put yourself in the limelight. You can be accurate and you can also be a generalist. People want to know, and at the back of the room are people who will not ask the question until 20 other people have asked the question. From the information I got, many people who ask the first questions already know the answer. They just want to say their thing. It's the next row, and it's the people who are 5 or 10 and 20 minutes in who are asking really interesting questions. Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the astrophysicist, talked about the fact that she's had women come up to her at the end of a talk and say, not only did I do astronomy because of you, I named my daughter after you. And she regarded that as a profound responsibility. Yeah, and again, so respond, be part of that relationship, because the relationships are out there. People are having relationships with us and with science all the time. We don't necessarily know it, but they're there for the taking if you recognise them. The end.